Here's today's First Word Daily Devotion.
We closed August the 16th with a reference to the third day here in our Esther narrative. And let's open August 17th at Esther 5 through 7, again with the same tone from yesterday, on the third day. And remember, when we read the Bible, we're reading the third day in salvation terms. Because we've been taught to read it that way, teaching it to be read that way comes not from me, but it comes from the apostles. And of course, the apostles learned it from Jesus Christ, who was risen on the third day. And so on the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. Now, we're going to see this repeated, so pay attention. When the Bible repeats something, it's not there but wasting ink. It's there to let us know what's being emphasized. What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given you even to the half of my kingdom. And Esther said, If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king. Then the king said, Bring Haman quickly, so we may do to Esther as she asked. And of course, now we flip ahead to Haman. Verse 9, Haman went out that day joyful and glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. He sent and brought his friends and his wife Zeresh. And Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions which the king had honored him, and how he had advanced him above the officials of the servants of the king. Then Haman said, Even Queen Esther, let no one but me come with the king to the feast she prepared. Tomorrow I am invited by her together with the king. Yet all this is worth nothing to me, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Then his wife Zeresh and his friends said to him, now pay attention, Let gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it. Then go joyfully with the king to the feast. This idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. Chapter 6. On that night the king could not sleep. He gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the chronicles, and they were read before the king, and it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigtha and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, who guarded the threshold, and who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, What honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? The king's young men who attended him said, Nothing has been done for him. And the king said, Who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he prepared for him. The king's young men said, Haman is there standing in the court. The king said, Let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king said to him, What shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? And Haman said to himself, Whom would the king delight to honor more than me? So Haman said to the king, For the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought which the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown is set. And let the robes of the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the square to the city, proclaiming before him, Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Then the king said to Haman, Hurry, take the robes and the horse as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned. And so when we read that, the Bible in Esther, the Lord's name is never mentioned. Elohim, God, is never mentioned. But of course we see him all through the narrative. What we read in chapter 6 of a sleepless night of the king, we understand the Lord stirring his heart, because that's the way the chronicler has taught us to read his theological reading. We read the Bible in light of reality, and the reality is a theological understanding. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate. Haman hurried to his house, and of course his head covered, And let's skip ahead to chapter 7. The king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther, and the second day they were drinking wine after the feast. The king again said to Esther, "What's your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. What's your request? Even to half my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, if it but pleases the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we've been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king." Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is he? Who has dared to do this?" And Esther said, "A foe, an enemy, this wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. The king rose in his wrath from the wine drinking and went into the palace garden, but Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. The king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine, as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. And the king said, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house?" As the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. Then Haborna, one of the king's eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, "Moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing at Haman's house 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Hang him on that." And of course, here we have the providence of God taking care of his people. Now, that reminds us of Psalm 43. "Vindicate me, O God. Defend my cause against an ungodly people." Do you remember what we saw yesterday in the Psalms? This narrative, this line, this stanza repeated. So we see it again. "Why are you cast down, O my soul? Why are you in turmoil within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my salvation and my God." Who is this God? Well, 2 Corinthians 9 tells us. Oh, I want you to see this. 2 Corinthians 9 tells us, look at verse 15. Who is this God? This God is Jesus. And we thank God for the indescribable gift of Jesus Christ. He is our salvation. He is our hope. And thank God, he who was faithful then is faithful now. He never changes. Seasons change, as we'll read a little later in Hebrews. Seasons change, time change. Isaiah is going to tell us that young men grow weary, youths they tire, but our God never tires, and he is the God in whom we trust.